My name is Dr. Ray Beiersdorfer. I live here in Youngstown, Ohio. I'm a distinguished professor of geology at the Department of Geological and Environmental Sciences at Youngstown State University, where I've been on the faculty for 24 years. I also have oil and gas experience. I worked for Gulf Oil between my master's and PhD as an exploration geologist looking for oil and gas in California, Oregon, Washington, and Nevada. I'm here because since the advent of shale oil and gas development due to high volume, high pressure hydraulic fracturing in long laterals, which I'll refer to as fracking, in this area, my human rights have been violated. Specifically, my rights to health and clean water, my right to housing, my right to access to information, and my right to public participation. I'm not planning on focusing on the water issue, as I know many other people will have spoken on that, but I want to focus on my rights to housing, access to information, and public participation due to the earthquakes that we have been suffering in this region since the advent of fracking has come here. I'll start off with a couple of things about the access to information and then my right to public participation, and then go into more detail about the earthquakes. The Ohio Department of Natural Resources, I'll call them ODNR, has been deliberately withholding information about earthquakes related to oil and gas development from the general public. I will go in and outline several examples of that. Moreover, here in Ohio, government regulators conspired with the oil industry in secret to mount a propaganda campaign to convince the public that it was a good idea to frack in our state parks. And one of that highlighted that to me, as well as some of these other issues, is that when you can't tell the difference between the regulatory agency and the industry they're supposed to regulate, that is definitely an example of a captured agency. When we had the earthquakes in Ohio in 2011, we had over 8 months of earthquakes, and a ODNR representative, her name was Heidi Hetzel Evans, told our local newspaper that ODNR has not seen any evidence that shows a correlation between localized seismic activity and deep injection well disposal. This was blatantly false, and there was a strong correlation both in space and time between the two. My 80-year-old neighbor could see the connection, my freshman students could see the connection, yet the state regulator was denying that there was any connection at the time. My right to public participation is being violated in that because I've been speaking out about the harms of fracking, and both my wife and I, who are both teachers, have been suffering a hostile work environment as a result of this. As educators, we feel it's a responsibility to let the citizens know about the documented harm of fracking in Ohio and elsewhere. I was told by the STEM dean at the time, Dr. Martin Abraham, that my wife should not say that she works at YSU and is opposed to fracking. Talk about, the lack of academic freedom, because when she continued to do that, as a part-time faculty member, she was non-hired for 2 years. Eventually, though, she was hired back after that. But for 2 years, my family suffered a loss of income due to her exerting her rights for academic freedom. I'm a tenured full professor, but I've also been fighting an ongoing hostile work environment that began in 2012. My written comments that I've submitted to you document some examples of that, but I planned on just sort of going on and talking about the earthquakes now. You feel free to ask me more questions if you want. We've had earthquakes in Ohio. Since around Revolutionary War time, there's been documented around 200 earthquakes in the area. Some of them up along the Great Lakes, some down along the Ohio River, and most of them were in western Ohio near the town of Anna, Ohio, which was an extension of the New Madrid-Wabash Valley Fault Zone. And they had damaging earthquakes in 1930, 1931, and twice in 1937. Some interesting information about that is that there were swarms of aftershocks, and John Armbruster, a seismologist at Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, went back and looked at newspaper accounts at the time and confirmed that there was oil and gas wells operating in the area at the time of the quakes. And he said because of the swarms and the prolonged series of earthquakes, along with the oil and gas operations, it's a possible candidate that there may have been induced not fracking, but induced oil and gas earthquakes even back then in the 1930s. Much more recently, there was an injection well, a Class 1 injection well in Ashtabula, Ohio, north of here, that triggered earthquakes in 1987, and then another set on a different fault in 2001. They shut the well down because of the seismic activity in 1994, so 7 years later, we were still getting induced earthquakes due to this Class 1 injection well. So there is some precedent of having induced seismicity in the state before this oil and gas activity started up in here around in 2011. Since then, 5 counties in Ohio, all of which had no recorded earthquakes since European settlement in the state, over 250 years of settlement, there had been no recorded earthquakes. We've suffered over 1,100 positive magnitude earthquakes during that time. All of these earthquakes were human-induced due to either fracking or the injection of fracking waste. They're restricted to 6 locations. 2 of them are housing injection wells, and 4 of them have fracking well pads nearby. One interesting point is that ODNR has a policy. They have, not the Oil and Gas Division, but the Geological Division has the Ohio Seismic Network, and they have a website, and they post recent seismic activity for the state. Their policy is that if an earthquake is magnitude 2.0 or greater, or if it was less than 2.0 but people felt it, it goes on their website. There are numerous earthquakes that have happened, particularly here in Mahoning County and Harrison County, that they violated their own rules. They didn't put them on, or delayed their putting them on after I started to inquire why they weren't put on there. Again, a violation of access to information. The couple of wells that were significant, the North Star 1 injection well here in Youngstown. It began injecting fracking waste in December of 2010, and by the time it was shut down, it had injected over 20 million gallons of this waste beneath Youngstown. The permit conditions put the maximum pressure at 1,890 psi. That was on the permit, but they requested and got increases in the pressure from the state regulators, and so when they finally shut it down, it was injecting at 2,500 psi. The small earthquakes began in January, right? They started in December 2010. The small earthquakes began in January. They were kept secret from the public, and it wasn't until March 17th when there were 2 earthquakes that I felt them. I was up that morning, and they were big enough to get on the regional network, and so then we became more aware of that. One thing they did issue a report, the Ohio Department of Resources issued a preliminary report, never a final report. But in that report, I was able to discover that on March 14th, the company had requested an increase in pressure. On March 16th, the pressure was granted. ODNR said, great, you can increase the pressure. March 17th, we had 2 earthquakes, big enough for people felt them to get on the network. Again, they had started in January, but these were big enough to be felt. The pressure hadn't been increased yet, but 2 days later, the company went right ahead and increased the pressure, and the state regulators did nothing about it. They didn't say, let's hold back. We just had a couple of earthquakes. They did nothing about it at the time. That trend has actually continued, as I'll get to in just a bit. The North Star well was shut down on December 30th, 2011, and the next day, the largest, the magnitude 4.0 earthquake occurred, which caused damage to people's homes, and I think you've heard of some people that have had that problem. In a study, Dr. Wang-Young Kim of Columbia University concluded that continued ejection at this well could have triggered potentially large and damaging earthquakes. The ODNR issued a bunch of new rules, one of which required to having monitoring on these waste trucks with GPS monitoring. That was never implemented, still to this day hasn't been implemented. And if it had, it would have prevented the illegal dumping of over 480,000 gallons into the Mahoning River by the operator that had caused all those earthquakes. We've also had earthquakes in Niles and Trumbull County, Ohio. That is on the 108 earthquakes on a deep injection well that's less than 3 miles away from a dam, the Meander Reservoir or Mineral Ridge Dam that provides drinking water over 400,000 people. That well is shut down and should be plugged and abandoned, but they're still battling in the courts for that. Also in Poland, Ohio, in March of 2014, 77 earthquakes occurred along 300 meters of a previously unknown fault, and it got national and international recognition because it was the first case in the U.S., we thought at the time, that fracking had triggered earthquakes. It had turned out in October of 2013, before that, 400 earthquakes had been triggered by fracking in Harrison County to the south. ODNR knew about this because they deployed portable seismic monitors, but they kept it secret for a year until the published paper came out when they were finally had to admit it. Then about a few months after that, they put them on their website. After the Poland earthquakes, there was no report issued, just a press release. And that press release highlighted that new policies were going to be implemented. Any permits given to a fracking well within 3 miles of a known fault was going to have these special permit conditions. I found a case of a well that was permitted after this announcement 1 mile from a known fault, no special permit conditions. And I have in writing from the head of ODNR, it was called the Luster Well, and the Oil and Gas Resource Management Chief replied to me in writing, the permits for the Luster wells issued on December 2nd, 2014 improperly did not include the seismic monitoring conditions. Most recently, this past April in Monroe County, there was a magnitude 3 earthquake, and ODNR paused the conditions for that. It turned out that there had actually been 5 other earthquakes between magnitudes 1.8 and 2.3, and they did nothing. They refused to even tell me what well they told to pause, yet because they violated their rules again, because their new rules said magnitude 1.0 or greater, we have to hold things down. So another case where they're not following their own rules and regulations. I'll just finish with saying the public needs assurance that all rules, regulations, or permit conditions are adequate and they are accurately being observed. This clearly is not the case in Ohio. The state government is turning a blind eye to the seismic harm from corporations involved in fracking. Ohio is not holding up its human rights obligations. And I want to finish with stressing that even if they had these rules, regulations, or permit conditions being followed, they don't prevent earthquakes, not here in Ohio or not anyplace else. Thank you.
So I have a question, and then I'll pass it to my colleagues if they have one. So you said, so they are monitoring earthquakes all the time. Somebody is.
Yes.
Right? But they only put them on the website when either you hoot and holler about it or people actually feel it?
Yes, if their rules are if they're felt or magnitude 2, they're supposed to be put on. We had a series in 2017, which they're actually putting on the website now. So these passed through. There's been 3 counties. I brought a map here if anybody, you or anyone in the audience wants to see. But Vinton County, Belmont County, Monroe County, this year have had fracking-related earthquakes, or at least 2 of them have been called fracking-related earthquakes. They did put those on, so they are getting a little bit better for that. One of the problems I have with who owns the data. In Niles, the company that is doing the injecting was in charge of the data. It was given to the ODNR, so they had access. The company owned the data, and the general public was not giving any access for that. The U.S. Geological Survey has said that this data needs to be made available to the public in real time in order to have any trust, but clearly the state is not doing that.
Yeah, that was my question, is
Yes.
whether there's any way to make it available to public in the real time because it's being monitored in real time.
Yeah, it could be made available.
And we live in an electronic world where
Yeah.
it wouldn't be a huge burden to put it up there.
No, it could be made available to the public. The state is refusing to do so.
And why do you think that is?
I personally think because they're a captured agency. When these things happen, they talk to the corporation causing the harm and keep it as secret as long as possible from the public.
So is the information they don't put online, is that, but they have from the company, but they don't put it up online, is that available through Freedom of Information if you were to
That's what
submit
I have to do, and that's what I've told. I have to do Freedom of Information requests, public records requests to get the information. I had to do that after the Poland earthquakes, and I will be doing it after these most recent ones.